Have you ever wondered what the path forward is about and what it has to do with managing our wild horses? If so, this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Debbie Coffey onto the show today to talk about the path forward. I've known Debbie for many years, and she's one of the unsung heroes of wild horse and burro advocacy. She had a fantastic radio show for 6 years called Wild Horse and Burro Radio, and the archives are still online. She interviewed such a vast array of authorities on so many subjects helpful for the wild horses. And she also is wonderful at ferreting out information that can be helpful for our wild horses and burros. So I am very happy to have her on the show today. Let's get started, Debbie.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be on your show, Carol.
You're very welcome.
I always love it when we get together.
Yeah, it's great.
It's nothing but trouble. Well, I've been talking about how they're zeroing out so many herd management areas and rounding up so many horses. I think I'd like to talk a little bit about this path forward, because the only thing it was a path forward to was extinction of wild horses and burros. I said it then. I'm saying it now. We're seeing it. Most people that are new, the livestock industry groups like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association have been lobbying for killing and slaughter of wild horses and burros on public lands, even though on 80% of BLM land grazed by livestock, there are no wild horses on it. So it's like very few horses. My problem with the path forward, I feel like it's the biggest betrayal to wild horses and burros since the act was passed. The Wild Horse and Burro Act was passed since 1971. This has been the biggest betrayal to the wild horses and burros. For the Humane Society Legislative Fund, Return to Freedom, Humane Society of the United States, American Mustang Foundation, ASPCA, for them to have signed on to this document is just unbelievable. First of all, this document is based on a lie. It defines the problem, quote unquote, as being too many wild horses and burros on public lands, the cost of roundups and holding facilities, and blaming wild horses and burros for seemingly all the damage to rangelands. That's just a huge lie. Right now, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, PEER, they just wrote an article. It came out in May 2024. More than 2/3 of BLM acreage is not meeting its own minimum health standards are due solely to livestock overgrazing, while less than 1% of those failing acres are due to wild horses. They also said nationally only 77 allotments out of 21,000 allotments are failing due in whole or in part to wild horses. So the wild horses are not a big problem on our public lands. Privately owned livestock are a huge problem. That's the problem. So this whole path forward, focusing only on wild horses, was just a betrayal. And I noticed something funny, Carol. I was looking over some old articles that I'd written when this first came out, the path forward. And I brought up that BLM's 2017 public land statistics, this is something they put out annually. Well, back then, it was issued in June of 2018. So, kind of around the time of the path forward, they had a chart that was going to be on public grazing lands administered by the BLM. And all the data was completely omitted, with the exception of Table 2.1 is reserved for use in a future edition of public land statistics and is currently in development. Well, I went back and looked at the 2023 public lands. They don't even mention it at all. So apparently it never got developed. And not only that, they just took it off the public land statistics issue. So The BLM turns a blind eye to livestock grazing. They do it, it's a sleight of hand. Instead of seeing millions of cattle out there, they'll focus on two horses, and one blade of grass. So for these groups to know nothing or to sit down, I read some stuff on the Cloud Foundation that Ginger Catherine had written. And apparently they told Ginger, in order to get the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to sit down at the table with them, they had to give up on the AUMs. They couldn't even bring that up. And then Ginger had been talking with them because these people are all based in Washington, D.C. I've never seen them at roundups. I don't see that they've ever filed Freedom of Information Act to get records. I don't know that they've done research papers or articles. I don't know what they do for wild horses and burros. Maybe you can help me out there, Carol. But they're basically invisible, except they turned up here for the path forward.
Right. ASPCA and Humane Society of the United States. Absolutely. They have not been involved at all. And then suddenly here in 2019, they're supposedly representing all the wild horse groups. No, they were not.
Yeah. Most people saw it. They didn't want to hear it. So anyhow, they stopped returning Ginger's calls. But what I see, they totally capitulated.
I think what they said was they did this to increase the use of birth control, but that didn't even happen.
No. So basically, all that happened was they agreed to a roundup of 15 to 20,000 wild horses and burros, 3 years, fertility control for 90% of the mares remaining on the range, and a sex ratio skewing of 70% stallions to 30% mares. That is extinction on top of what was already difficult. When they set the AML, the appropriate management level, this was just some cockamamie thing that the BLM came up with. Even in the National Academies of Science, it was unscientific the way they come up with this. And what's really outrageous was back when the Act first came in 1971, the AML was 26,710 horses. They didn't even do a survey for 2 or 3 years after that to see how many horses they were. So who knows how many horses? There could have been more, but already that number was too low to sustain genetic viability. So most herds were already at risk for health issues, inbreeding, and extinction when they came up with the act. That's what they were worried about. So now BLM is keeping it at that level.
Right. And the appropriate management levels were really very random numbers that were set to be supposedly the carrying capacity for wild horses on each herd management area. And they can only be revised in the resource management plan, which only gets revised every 20 to 30 years.
Well, not only that, Carol, these days cattle are bigger. They eat more forage. The BLM is just so archaic. It's like it's stuck in the beginning of the 19th century or something. And the cattlemen don't want to change that. They get those cheap grazing fees. They don't want to change anything. But what BLM is doing is they're continually hiding the data regarding the damage caused by livestock grazing on public lands.
Yeah, and this data is supposed to be included in every environmental assessment before a roundup, and they just don't do it.
They don't do it. And interestingly enough, BLM is failing what it's supposed to do. The peer came up and they said the last time, that they were talking about how BLM hadn't published a rangeland inventory monitoring evaluation data for a long time. The last time they published it, I just went on before the show and looked, was 2019. So they haven't published this data. So they're not doing it, and they're trying to cover their tracks. They're not monitoring these grazing allotments, and they're just blaming everything on the horses.
Exactly. And it's very alarming in the path forward that they're talking about removing 130,000 horses over 10 years.
We're not going to have any left. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And right now the holding facilities are full. There's some room in short-term holding, but the long-term facilities are all full. They're also mostly now private. And I can see in the path forward, they suggested private holding facilities, meaning the public does not get to see these horses unless there happens to be a random tour every 2 or 3 years.
Of one or two of them.
Of one or two of them, not all of them by any means.
There's kind of an analogy I use. That's like, These wild horses belong to the American people. So it's kind of like somebody takes your wallet from you and says, I'm going to put your wallet at my house and don't worry, I'll take care of it. You don't know what happened to your money or your ID card. You've lost something and they're not accountable for it. And it's just wrong.
Absolutely, Deb. And yes, and this explains the acceleration of the roundups. And I mean, this year we have had 17,330 wild horses removed from their homes.
And they can't get them all adopted. They were pushing this adoption incentive program. And as you know, American Wild Horse Campaign got a lot of FOIA documents and was able to prove that many of them were going to slaughter. Everybody's relatives were buying some because they were getting $1,000 each. So they'd pull up with truckloads and take them, and you could like only get 4 a piece or something at the most, but then they'd have all their friends and relatives go, so they'd make a bunch of money. But then they were ending up, we could prove, when they show up at these slaughterhouses, you get the freeze mark numbers. And then by the records, we could see these were AIP horses and they were going to slaughter.
And now the BLM is considering giving people $3,000 per horse.
Oh my God.
This is just insane. It's like a huge money-making bonanza for the worst sorts of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the BLM is not even doing their job managing public lands. They're not doing it managing the wild horses and burros either. It's almost like they're doing the exact opposite. If they could do anything worse, I can't think of what it would be. Anybody else would be embarrassed by these failures. They're not.
Yeah. And then the solution in the path forward is get more holding facilities, so that they can fill those up too. Yeah. And continue to spend an incredible amount of taxpayer dollars.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, when I first started looking and thinking about this, one thing that really bothered me, it's like when I looked at the group on this path forward. Well, first, let me just read. Okay, Farm Bureau, Society for Range Management, Public Lands Council, National Horse and Burro Rangeland Management Coalition. All these other people are members of this, and they're the ones that put on the Slaughter Hump Summit in Utah. Remember that secretive meeting? Yes. But most of the groups weren't allowed to go. There was Beaver County Commission's office and Eureka County Commission office. Well, that includes J.J. Goycochea, in Nevada, and Beaver County, they just hate the wild horses. So, and Utah, got mixed up in all this.
Because of Chris Stewart, of course.
Yeah, because of Chris Stewart. So anyhow, so they had this secretive slaughter summit. And when Chris Stewart came up with that amendment that would allow all wild horses and burros in BLM holding facilities and on public lands to be killed, I mean, everybody had a big uproar. So here are these groups, Humane Society, Return to Freedom, ASPCA, and the American Mustang Foundation sign up with these people. I'm going to sit at the table with them. And before they even get started, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association wouldn't even come to the table unless they agreed not to say anything about the AUMs. So why would you sit at the table with these people? And they said, oh, it's because politicians were getting tired of us fighting. So what, you just give up and capitulate everything because politicians are tired of hearing about it? That's their job. You don't give up.
And you include more groups. Mm-hmm. You don't just say, these 3 groups are the only groups interested in wild horses or managing wild horses or helping wild horses. It was absurd.
Well, they pick the groups that do the least. They're not, these are Washington, D.C. based lobbyists, basically ASPCA and HSUS. And here's the funny thing. So 9 months before this path forward came out, this American Mustang Foundation was founded as a Nevada nonprofit. And it was formed by Washington, D.C. lobbyists. Alan Freemeyer was a lobbyist for energy and mining companies in the state of Utah. His wife, she was a lobbyist in Washington. James Sadler of Montana, who was listed as their secretary, he surrendered his law license many years before because he had 5 theft charges and it was before the Bar Association. So he had to give that up. So you've got somebody that was crooked and had to give up their law license. And then you have Andrew Lasofsky, who's president of Big Game Forever. So he's a lobbyist there in Washington too. And his wife, Emily, was the senior policy advisor to Senator Dean Heller. He was in Nevada, wild horse hater from Nevada for many years. And she was a professional staff member on the subcommittee on the Interior and Environment. So anyhow, says American Mustang Foundation, they weren't wild horse advocates. And
Yeah.
as Ginger said, Ginger spent decades in the wild, studying the wild horses, doing documentaries, really learning about them. These people from HSUS and ASPCA, like I said, I don't think I've ever seen them at one roundup. I
No,
don't think they've even sent somebody to one roundup.
no.
And these people have more money than God. Where are they getting the word out trying to save horses? I've never seen them file the Freedom of Information Act request. I've never even seen articles by them.
I've seen articles by HSUS a long time ago, but not
Yeah.
recently.
No.
Mm-mm.
But not anything investigative, like what's happening to the horses in wild.
Right.
They want to send them all the while to these holding facilities. They never check up on what's happening to them afterwards.
Exactly.
American Wild Horse Campaign has been very great about filing Freedom of Information Act about the deaths, what's happening with drought, or with these places, because they're mostly the most of the long-term pastures are in Oklahoma and Kansas, as you know. What's happening with drought. So they're the only ones tracking what happens to these horses after they get off the range.
And of course, our big concern is that at some point, Congress may say, this is too much money being spent on these horses and holding facilities, so let's just kill them all.
That's what's going to happen. They won't be able to keep it up.
I think we're at over 70,000 wild horses are in holding, which is probably more than there are left on the range.
Oh, absolutely.
And if they say that it's $46,000 per horse for their lifetime, I mean, that's an insane amount of money.
Mm-hmm. I would like to see all of the wild horse advocacy groups get together, not including HSUS and ASPCA, and come up with another path forward, a different path forward. We don't need the Cattlemen's Association at the table.
How about a path to freedom?
Yeah.
I like to see these horses in short and long-term holding put back out on the acres, the millions of acres that were taken away from wild horses originally, and to live out their lives in the wild.
Yeah.
And not be in feedlots.
The males have already been castrated, all the males all the stallions. Yeah, I think you're right, Carol. I think that's what we have to do. And, I don't think a lot of people know how many millions of acres were taken away from the original herd areas.
Right.
And then they said, oh, we're going to have herd management areas. And then they started doing complexes. And, it's just, they're whittling it down to nothing. And we're at a very dire point right now, I believe.
Yes. And we have just in Wyoming right now, where they're pushing to zero out 2.5 herds. And then if we lose our appeal of our lawsuit, they're going to use the same argument to zero out more herd management areas all across the country. We are at a very dire tipping point right now.
Carol, did you tell the people what lawsuit this is? Could you mention it quickly?
Sure. It's the checkerboard lawsuit in Wyoming, and it's the BLM revised the resource management plan for Adobe Town, Great Divide Basin, and Salt Wells Creek, zeroing out 2 herds and half of another herd area. This was done last May, and American Wild Horse Campaign, Animal Welfare Institute, Western Watersheds, me, Chad Hansen, and Kimberly Curl are all plaintiffs on the lawsuit. We lost. Judge Rankin ruled against us, but we now have an appeal in the 10th Circuit Court. We're hoping that we do win this appeal, of course, because what's at stake is if these herds are zeroed out, then they're going to go on and continue zeroing out more herds. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the end of our wild horses. Mm-hmm. The Rock Springs Grazing Association is driving this whole thing. It's not that there isn't enough land, because we're talking about 2 million acres. It's because the Rock Springs Grazing Association wants every last horse gone.
And I don't know if a lot of people, I doubt if there's even 30 people that are members of the Rock Springs Grazing Association.
It's about 24 families.
Yeah, 24 families ruling over 1 million acres of public lands.
2 million.
Well, is it 1 million of it private land and 1 million public
Right.
lands
Yeah,
of the
that.
checkerboard. So 1 million acres of public lands, they are, running roughshod over with what they want. So I think for the path for freedom, not only get all the horses out of holding and get the land back that's been taken away from them, we also need for the BLM to update and clarify AUMs based on
AMLs, you mean?
well, the AUMs so that these cattle that are bigger and eating more forage like a fair assessment of the forage they're eating. And considering how few horses are on these grazing allotments areas.
And they have a lot of work to do, the BLM does, because they need to do range health assessment for all of these herd management areas. So that's like 101, I believe. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's only like 7 that they've actually done recent assessment of. So
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be done before anything is done, because you can't manage wild horses if you don't know what the range conditions are. And if there's a problem, then you need to also adjust your livestock AUMs. I'm really tired of seeing, sheep out there in April when the grass is just starting to grow and they eat everything down to the ground. They take the sheep off and then they put the cattle on.
Mm-hmm.
And the range has no chance to be healthy. And then they say, well, the horses are out there 24/7, so it's their fault.
Yeah. Well, also, Peer wrote another article 2 months ago, America's Ailing Overgrazed Rangelands. And they said from 2019 to 2023, while they're removing all these horses, by the way, of more than 21,000 BLM grazing allotments in 10 Western states, more than 56 million acres fail BLM land health standards. And it's
And
not because of the horses, because there's hardly any of them left. It's the millions of livestock out there, privately owned.
and the BLM has the power to revoke these leases, these cattle grazing
Yeah,
leases. They
it's a
do.
privilege, not a right. It's a privilege.
Exactly. But the pressure from these grazing associations is unbelievable. The power and pressure and lobbying. This is just, it's very crooked.
But the BLM, they're supposed to, part of FLIPMA, the laws they work by is that they have to manage these lands for present and future generations. And there has to be, they call it the multiple use mandate. Well, that means a fair share for everybody. And
Right.
we see that the livestock grazing is get a much bigger share. Mining's getting a bigger share. The wild horses have the teeniest little share. Then it's not even fair.
Right. And it's too much for them. They would like to get rid of all the wild horses. I mean, the BLM, let's face it, the BLM are reluctant managers of the wild horses. It would be so much easier for them if they just all disappeared. And having a Secretary of the Interior like Deb Haaland, who is completely unresponsive, never makes a comment about wild horses, has done nothing to help them, hasn't helped.
No, it's been the worst ever. Once this path forward, once these groups agreed to it, it was like, oh, like, okay, the wild horse advocates said this was okay. This is what we're doing. They didn't ask any of us that had concerns. We were never at the table to discuss the issue. They didn't want us there.
And they didn't want comments from the public. There was no public comment period, nothing. It was just like, this is our new policy. This is what we're following.
I think it's really important right now for advocacy groups to get a new policy. This wasn't agreed upon by us, and we're speaking up for the wild horses and burros.
Right. And people are always asking me, what can I do to help? And one of the very basic, easy things to do is to be in touch with your representatives and your senators, because they need to care about what you want for our public lands.
And tell them that this path forward was based on a lie, and give them a couple of links to the peer reports, their latest 2 articles about, livestock grazing. So
which I'll put links to on my website.
Yeah.
So that you'll be able, with the podcast, so that you'll be able to find them. I'll also have a link to the Path Forward document so you can read it for yourself. The other issue is sterilization. They said use of humane birth control, but they did not rule out sterilization. They did not rule out gelding or ovariectomy by colpotomy on the mares, spaying, basically. They didn't rule out any of these things. And so these tools that the BLM is always talking about, the tools in their toolbox, are up for grabs. And they are starting to put these, either Gonacon, which is a known sterilant, or spaying or IUDs. They've been putting these in the new environmental assessments.
Well, also gelding, even when they do it at the off-range corrals, since I've gotten the mortality reports for so many,
Yes.
At Canyon City Prison and all, when you see the deaths, it's like from gelding, intestines fill out, intestines fill out, intestines fill out.
They basically have the vet students doing these procedures.
Just a lot of deaths from gelding procedures.
Gelding it's a stupid solution unless you get all of the stallions in the entire herd. I mean, a stallion can breed many mares. Mm-hmm. So it's not even a really good method of birth control. Also, this 70-30 sex ratio from the natural 50-50 is really, it's a nightmare. I've seen it at McCullough Peaks. They did about 70-30 in 2009. And what happened was you have this constant fighting and injuries of the stallions all the time. It's very disruptive for the herds, for the families, for the stallions, everybody. It is not a solution to help manage the population. It really isn't. So is there anything else that you had, Deb?
I think that was pretty much what I wanted to focus on today, just to let people know why this is happening and why it's wrong and what they can do.
And why there are, since 2020, 77,344 wild horses have been removed from our public lands.
In 4 years.
5 years.
5 years.
And whereas between 2016 and 2019, only 27,000 were removed. So if you're wondering why there's been an incredible speed up, this is why. And it needs to be stopped.
This path forward is the fast path to extinction for our wild horses and burros. And once they're gone, they're gone.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Deb. I so appreciate your depth of knowledge and your investigative techniques, being able to ferret out all the information. And thank you so much for being on here today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Carol.
If you'd like to get more information about the path forward and about the peer review studies, go to my website, www.wildhoofbeats.com, and go to podcasts, and I'll have those documents there for you to look at. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.